to refresh. So again, with the bolus entering the stomach, and you have all the gastric acids, and then eventually all the contents turn and mix due to the multiple layers of muscles that kind of twist and turn and cause the contractions of the stomach. And then it ends up in the pylorus, and then after once it exits that pyloric sphincter, it ends in the small intestines. And the first part of the small intestines is the duodenum or duodenum, with this mixture of that food and gastric acid is something called, I've heard chyme, I've heard chyme, but it's one of those tomatoes. It's not spelled with the I, but it is this mixture of gastric acid and food. That's what we call chyme. So it's liquefied and very acidic due to all that hydrochloric acid and gastric acid. Now, yeah, this chyme is like, ooh, if you've ever had the slate tripe stew, yeah, or actually I think I've talked about that again, but yeah, it's like, that's also why it can also really smell if you have this chyme left over and like if you eat something like tripe stew. But anyway, back to this. Now we're done with the stomach. We mixed up all the food with the gastric acid. Now we're going to go to the intestines, where we have chemical and physical digestion or mechanical digestion. So we're going to have enzymes mixing in it, and we already added a lot of hydrochloric acid. We're also going to have some even more mixing, physical mixing and mechanical mixing of this content. But one of the main functions of the small intestines, or just the intestines in general, is to absorb things, and including not just food and nutrients, but also water. And in fact, most of the water from your food and beverages and drinks are actually reabsorbed by the small intestines. But the large intestines do play a role in that as well. Okay, so there are three main parts to the small intestines. So you have the duodenum, so is it duodenum or is it duodenum? Again, I've heard multiple health professionals say both, and I'm not even too sure myself. I've heard both. But this is a little advice. If you're like doing clinical rotations and they say duodenum or they say duodenum, my advice is copy whatever they say. If you say, if they say like duodenum and you say, oh, did you mean duodenum? You're gonna kind of sound like a wise, smart Alex. So my strategy is just copy whatever the clinician is saying. So don't make waves. That's my advice to you. So, but the whole thing is like, that's the first part of the small intestines. Then you have the jejunum, and then you have the ileum. So there are three main sections, and this is my mnemonic to know them. What are these little treats? These are jujubes. And what if you eat too many of them? You would say, dude, I ate so many jujubes that I became ill. So it's not jejunum, but again, but that's what I'm trying to tell you, like the three sections in order. As you leave the stomach and end up in the large intestines, these are the three main regions of the small intestines in order. Now, we did talk about this a little bit when we have those lectures about the liver, but now let's zoom in on the duodenum itself. So why is the duodenum very important? Well, yeah, it's the first part that receives, or the first part of the small intestines that receives the contents from the stomach, but it's also important collection, or actually collects secretions from both the liver, gallbladder, or the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. So again, these are our accessory organs of digestion because they're not part of the main GI tract. But does that mean they're not important? No, they are very, very important because the liver produces bile, and the gallbladder helps to store and secrete extra bile if needed. And the pancreas does many things, but in terms of digestion, one of the main functions of the pancreas is to produce something called pancreatic juice. So the duodenum is very important because this is where they end up in the GI tract. It's at the duodenum that collects the bile and pancreatic juice. Now, if we zoom in here, we have the duodenum, and here we have the pancreas. The pancreas has three main parts: the head, body, and tail. And then there's a main pancreatic duct that collects pancreatic juice and funnels it to the duodenum. Then we have, there's also an accessory pancreatic duct, but this is more for if you're interested in like development, you might want to know this part. And here we have the tail of the pancreas. So again, this little part that's cradled by the duodenum is the head, and the tail is the part that pokes out toward the lateral side of your body. Now, is this the entire structure of the pancreas? Well, I don't expect you to know this part, but Remember, you might be like, hey, isn't pancreas the one that produces hormones like insulin and glucagon? And yes, that is correct. But the thing is that, so what you don't see in this image is that this isn't all there is to the pancreas. You also have a lot of blood vessels, a lot of arteries that carry blood to the pancreas, and a lot of veins that carry blood away from the pancreas. I don't think either version of the book has this anatomy of the vasculature, but what I'm getting at here is that the pancreas is actually pretty complex in terms of its histology and vessels and ducts. Now, if you zoom in, and here we have like a cross section, like say you take a sliver of pancreas and then you put in a microscope slide, it might look something like this. And what we have here is like, okay, you might be like, oh, pancreas, insulin, right? So remember that the pancreas is a part of the endocrine system. And what does an endocrine system involve? It involves hormones. And where do hormones go? They go into the bloodstream. So you might remember things like pancreatic islets, or things like the alpha cells and beta cells that are found in these islets that make insulin and glucagon. So where do they secrete that? Well, again, these hormones end up in blood vessels because hormones by definition, travel through the blood and end up targeting other cells elsewhere in your body. Now, with the pancreas, it's also important in digestion in the digestive system, but instead of secreting it into the endocrine system and blood vessels, you have exocrine secretion. So endo means inside, and exocrine, now instead of being inside your blood vessels, it's going to be on surfaces of your body. So even though like our pancreas is part of our internal organs, all our food, it is introduced from the outside and it eventually ends up back on the outside too, right? So this exocrine secretions, instead of going into these blood vessels, instead of being secreted by pancreatic islets, we have these things called pancreatic acini. So these are like these different groups of cells, so they're separate from pancreatic islets. Instead of secreting into the bloodstream, they secrete into pancreatic ducts. So these pancreatic acini, they're going to produce these pancreatic juice. So what is pancreatic juice? Well, this is what we just call the substance that's secreted by these acini and epithelial cells that line these pancreatic ducts. So it's an exocrine secretion because it's being secreted onto a cell surface. And this is why so here we have all these acini here, and they're producing all this pancreatic juice. And it all ends up collecting in these larger and larger ducts that eventually end up in the duodenum. And what's important? Well, remember you have all that gastric acid from the stomach, so one important component of pancreatic juice is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a weak base, and it's going to help to neutralize the acid found in gastric juice and that very acidic kind. And it also contains many different types of enzymes, and in fact, this is why the pancreas is also very important, because remember those biological macromolecules? Well, the pancreas is an all-star. It can actually digest all 4 categories of major biological macromolecules. And you produce about 1 liter of this pancreatic juice every day, so this is very important in not only neutralizing the stomach acid, but also in terms of digesting the contents that were digested by that stomach acid and is now chyme. And remember our biological macromolecules, so what are the major ones that are involved in nutrition and calories? We have carbohydrates, proteins, and fats and lipids. Nucleic acids not on the nutrition label because they don't significantly count toward your calorie and energy intake. Now, macromolecule enzymes to refresh. Remember we have things like carbohydrases such as amylases. These break down carbohydrates. Lipases break down lipids and fats, and especially triglycerides. Proteases break down proteins, right? So polypeptides. And nucleases break down nucleic acids. So what are the enzymes that the pancreas produces? Well, I already talked about it, but yeah, so pancreatic alpha amylase is going to break down carbohydrates. Pancreatic lipase is going to break down fats and triglycerides. Pancreatic proteases are going to break down proteins and polypeptides. And pancreatic nucleases are going to break down nucleic acids. Even though they don't participate in energy intake, I'm just telling you that the pancreas is amazing because it can digest all types of macromolecules. And what if someone's not producing enough pancreatic juice or pancreatic enzymes? This is why some people, if they're not producing enough of these enzymes, or if they have something we call pancreatic insufficiency, where the pancreas is still kicking but not doing enough, well, what's that going to affect? Well, the whole purpose of these enzymes are to convert your food into a small enough form that your cells can absorb them. So if you don't have enough of these enzymes, you're actually going to have less nutrient intake because you're not able to break down those huge macromolecules into a usable form by your cells. And look, if you look at this pancreatic enzyme formula, what do we see here is used in this? You have amylases, lipases, and proteases. So if someone's not producing enough pancreatic juice or these enzymes in that juice, they might be asked to take one of these enzymes to help in breaking down their food so that they can get more nutrition and calories from rather than if they had insufficient pancreatic enzymes and or juices. Okay, so now we're going from the duodenum. Now we're going to go to the jejunum, or actually before we go to the jejunum, let's talk about what's another important part of the duodenum. So duodenum is important in neutralizing acids and actually receiving the bile and pancreatic juices from the liver and pancreas respectively. But it's also the source of many types of hormones. Now, do I want you to know everything in this slide here? Not necessarily, and I'm just going to cut the 4 hormones I want you to know are these. Or actually, so gastrin. So gastrin, you might be like, hey, that sounds familiar. And yes, that's the same gastrin in the stomach. So the stomach is not the only source of gastrin. And the overall purpose of gastrin is to increase overall stomach activity. So such as like the churning and motility of the stomach and hydrochloric acid, gastrin bumps both of those up. Now, secretin is interesting because it increases the pancreatic secretion of bicarbonate, which is that base that helps that makes the pancreatic juice more alkaline. So if you have a very acidic chyme coming into the duodenum from the stomach, your pancreas is going to secrete more secretin because it's like, ooh, this stuff is really acidic. Let's neutralize it because this acidic stuff could burn our intestines if it continues to travel down the length of our small and large intestines. And it also increases the bile production by the liver. So secretin is going to bump up both, like the production of both the pancreas and the liver. Now, cholecystokinin, so this is, or CCK, so what's the main trigger of CCK secretion is our fatty acids, which are from triglycerides, and amino acids from proteins. So if you have a very fatty or proteinaceous meal, like say you ate a cheeseburger or double, quadruple, triple Whopper or something like that, you're going to produce a lot of CCK. So what's it going to do? Well, it's going to tell your stomach, hey, okay, we got this really fatty and protein-rich meal. Hold up a bit. Don't dump more into me. I'm going to have a lot to deal with this fat and protein you just gave me. So what's it going to do with that fat? Well, chole, right? So chole sounds like cholesterol. So it's going to try to deal with all those fats by increasing bile production. And it's also going to suppress hunger. So CCK is also important in telling in satiety and feeling full. So if you don't produce enough CCK, you might feel hungry. But if you have this super rich meal coming in, that's kind of saying, okay, we don't need more. Let's hold off on digesting more. And then this is where, again, Martini is sometimes needs to be updated. And it actually includes this former name for gastric inhibitory peptide. Thankfully, now that we know more about it. So initially, how they discovered is they injected a whole bunch of this into animals, and they saw that it decreased gastric acid. And that's why it had the original name GIP, because it inhibited gastric acid production. But actually, secretin is the main one that reacts to gastric acid, not GIP. So they actually renamed it to glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptides. So they kept it GIP, so they still have it, but they just changed the meaning because why? Well, the main thing that stimulates GIP secretion is the glucose. If they have a very carb-rich content in your meal, that's going to increase the osmolarity in your duodenum, and that's going to trigger the release of GIP. So GIP, what's it going to do in response to the glucose? hey, what's that hormone your body produces in response to high glucose concentration? It's going to produce insulin because remember that insulin moves glucose from your bloodstream into your body's cells, thereby lowering your blood sugar. So this GIP is actually very important so if you have a high carb content, you're going to produce more GIP, and GIP is actually going to increase the production of insulin that helps to lower your blood sugar and move insulin out of your bloodstream and into your cells. So that's the main one. These are the main four I want you to know in terms of duodenal hormones. Okay, so after the duodenum, we have the ileum, and there is a little band of tissue that helps to form this kind of bend we see right here. So that's the border between the duodenum and the jejunum. So that's the middle segment. And the jejunum, what is special about that? Well, remember that the main function of the digestive system is to absorb nutrients. So the jejunum actually has the highest concentration of all these little changes in the mucosa, the innermost layer of our intestines, that actually increase the surface area to increase the absorption of broken down foods. Now that we've added all these enzymes and buffers to help neutralize it, now we want to get those nutrients into our bloodstream and from our gut and into our bloodstream. Now here's so again, this mucosa, submucosa, and muscular layer, they're all continuous, just different shapes. And in the jejunum, it takes on a very different shape. And what we have here is a cross section of the intestinal wall, and we have these things called circular folds, and these are these little ring-like structures. But yeah, if you take a just cross section of the small intestines, it's kind of like these little ruffles. And on these little ruffles, if you zoom in even more, you see all these little structures called villi. So these villi actually have even more structures, smaller structures on them called microvilli. So these microvilli are very, very small extensions. So you have we have our circular folds that have villi, and on each villi you have even more of these little bumps called microvilli. So I like to think of it this way. So I like to think of villi like little arms that stick out, but the microvilli are little fingertips that help to increase the surface area and increase the chance that any nutrients zooming by your intestinal lumen and the mucosa, that these nutrients will encounter the cell surface, because these are all the surface of these cells, so that they can be absorbed by these microvilli and villi and end up into your bloodstream and into your gut. And yeah, so that's the whole thing about this. This microvilli, they're needed to increase surface area. If you don't have them, well, can you still catch nutrients if you just have or can you still catch something with without using your fingers? Maybe you can, but it's more efficient if you have increased surface area by extending your fingers. So that's what microvilli are. Or if you watch this, I think this was from Doctor Strange, this scene right here. So if these are the intestinal cells or enterocytes, then villi are the extension of there, and then the microvilli are the even more smaller extensions from each villus. So that's what microvilli are like. But if you look at this microvilli, it forms something called a brush border. So if you look at them, they're very, very fine. And this hazy part right here are these microvilli. So they're all extending from a villus, and they're making this so all of this is a huge amount of surface area. It kind of looks like the bristles of a toothbrush or a paintbrush, and that's why they call it the brush border. So there are many enzymes that are actually found on the surface of this brush border, including things like proteases that digest polypeptides and proteins, but you also have things these enzymes that help to digest carbohydrates. So maltase, and if you remember all the way back in maybe it was the biochemistry chapter where we talk about disaccharides. So maltose is a disaccharide. So when you have glucose plus glucose, you have maltose. What will maltase do? Maltase will reverse this process. So instead of having maltose, when you have maltase and maltose, it's going to break it down and break it down into two glucose molecules. Lactase, and this is why if you're lactose intolerant, you might take Lactaid, which is basically this enzyme in pill form. So once this is in your gut, what is that going to do? Well, remember that lactose is actually a disaccharide, and it's from galactose being bound to glucose. So when you take lactase, or if you have lactase, you're going to break down lactose into galactose and glucose, which can be absorbed by these cells. And then sucrase sounds like sucrose, and sucrose is from the combination of fructose and glucose. So when you have sucrase, that's going to break down sucrose into fructose and glucose. So these are examples of enzymes you find at that brush border formed by all these microvilli. Now, when these molecules, all these macromolecules are broken down, and now they're in these small molecular forms, now they can be absorbed by your body through this network of vessels we see right here. So there are the main vessels that are found in these villi are, you can see right here. And the villi vessels, so there are two main types of vessels, so either capillaries or lymphatic vessels. And again, capillaries, they're bridging arteries and veins, so you have the arteries carrying the blood to these villi, and veins leading away from the villi and back to systemic circulation. So the capillaries, they're going to absorb carbohydrates and amino acids, because why? Well, carbohydrates and amino acids in general are water soluble, so it's easy to absorb these sugars and amino acids and put them into the water-based plasma of our blood. So it goes to the bloodstream and ends up back at the liver, and then back into to your heart and distribute to the rest of the body. Now lacteals, now notice that this little green part right here, that is a lacteal, and a lacteal is actually a special type of lymphatic vessel. So these lymphatic vessels called lacteals, they're only found in villi. So these lymphatic vessels, what do they carry? Well, they're going to carry fatty acids and triglycerides and lipids, because why? Well, remember, if we didn't get to cover atherosclerosis in detail here, but if you have like all these fats, do they dissolve easily in water-based solutions like our blood? Not really, right? So the thing is that if you won't have fats gumming up these capillaries if you put them in a different route. So these lacteals are like a different route for these fats to be transported. So lacteals, since they're lymphatic vessels, these fats are going to end up in lymph. And then these lymphatic vessel, when you have this like lymph that contains all this fat, it looks like this milky white fluid, and this is called chyle. So it's a small lymph from small intestines, but it contains small fat droplets, and it doesn't go straight to our system, the rest of our body. It actually gets processed by a liver so that you don't have these fat droplets floating around in your blood. But that's what I hope to cover in a few lectures. Alright, so moving stuff through the small intestines, we have something called segmentation. So it's migrating motility complex, basically a special form of peristalsis, and it's like these waves of contraction. So here's where we have the small intestines, and what's going to happen with this migrating motility complex? Well, you're going to have this, like here we have like one wave of contraction, and then same time later we're going to have another wave of contraction, but in different parts along the small intestines. So this is going to kind of like repeat itself, and what we have here is that we have these alternating waves and patterns of contraction along the small intestines. Now this results in something called segmentation, because say we have this little part right here, all this food and chyme and digestive juices being digested here. If you squeeze this part, it's going to squeeze it in both directions. So this part right here is going to squeeze some backwards, it's going to squeeze some forward. And this part right here, when you contract this part, it's going to squeeze some backwards and forwards. So what we have is a mixing of this content among these different segments. So these are like pockets of intestinal contents, but because it's not like peristalsis where it's just one direction and you're just moving this bolus along, it's kind of moving it back and forth due to the alternating waves of contraction. So I like to think of it as kind of, what eventually happens is that you mix all these contents, not these pockets of contents, with each other, and you also help with chemical digestion, because now you're kind of slowing. Instead of just having it just go one way, you're actually delaying the time it takes to go through your small intestines. So that's why it takes time to absorb food. So I like to think of it as kind of like salsa dancing. Sometimes you take a few steps forward, you also take a few steps back. So this is what segmentation is kind of like. It's taking like a few steps forward and a few steps back due to these alternate waves of contraction and movement. So this basically the whole purpose, mix it up. Okay, and then we'll end with the ileum. Oh shoot, sorry, 220. Okay, so we'll end with the ileum. So what's the main difference between the ileum and the jejunum? So there's not, if you just by looking at the intestines by itself, you can't really tell. Like the jejunum is the part that's closer to the duodenum. The ileum is the part that's closer to the colon and the large intestines. But in general, like those circular folds, you find them at the high. There are actually not too many of those circular folds in villi in the duodenum. The main function of the duodenum is to receive the bile and pancreatic juices and mix them all up. The jejunum is actually where you do most of the absorption, but those circular folds, villi and microvilli, get fewer and fewer and smaller as you get into the ileum. And you actually see more of what we call mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues, so basically kind of like less organized lymph nodes. That's what they're sort of like. You have more of these like immune patches of immune cells found within the ileum. But the ileum is, yeah, it's also very important in terms of what's it, vitamin absorption as well. So the ileum is that last part of the small intestines. Kind of hard to tell just by looking at it, but basically most absorption in the jejunum. Ileum is kind of like that final part where absorption is less important, and now or nutrient absorption is less important, and now you're absorbing things like water and vitamins as well.